The room was silent, too silent. The kind of silence that clings to the skin, heavy and suffocating, as if the walls themselves are holding their breath. Bill Gates sat alone at the edge of a long wooden table, his fingers pressed together, his shoulders drawn inward. The man who once commanded the world's largest software empire now seemed almost diminished. His eyes, pale blue and tired, carried the weight of decades' victories that turned into obsessions, choices that never stopped echoing. Outside, through the enormous glass windows of his private study, the night sky pressed down like a black curtain. The lights of Seattle flickered below, reminding him of the city where everything began and where everything could have ended. It wasn't wealth that haunted him. Money had always been the easiest part. What tormented him now, in the small hours of sleepless nights, was the memory of a single decision, a moment in time where he could have walked away, but didn't, a choice that had carved his legacy into stone and chained his soul to it forever. He whispered to himself, voice cracking in the quiet, "What if I had let it go? What if I hadn't reached for more?" The shadows didn't answer, but his mind did. The beginning of the dilemma, years earlier, Bill Gates was not yet a legend, nor a villain, nor a savior. He was simply a young man in glasses, obsessed with lines of code. To him, the world wasn't made of people and politics. It was made of logic, instructions, systems that could be bent to his will. But genius, when mixed with fear, becomes something darker. Bill feared irrelevance. He feared being left behind in a world that was moving faster than anyone could predict. In the early 1980s, the personal computer revolution was exploding, and Gates had one chance to secure his place at the center of it. The choice arrived cloaked in opportunity. IBM, the colossus of technology, wanted an operating system for its new personal computer. Gates didn't have one. Others did. But what he had, what no one else had, was a willingness to make a decision that blurred the lines between brilliance and ruthlessness. He decided to buy, not build, and he did it quietly, almost invisibly. For a modest sum, he acquired a system written by another programmer, rebranded it as MS-DOS, and handed it to IBM. But he kept something IBM hadn't demanded ownership of the software. It was a technicality, a loophole, a gamble. That single decision would ignite Microsoft's empire. But it also planted the first seed of a darker truth. Every victory in business is bought at the expense of someone else. The price of power, the deal with IBM, was not just a triumph. It was a lesson. Bill discovered something intoxicating. That control mattered more than creation. That leverage, contracts, and cunning could shape the destiny of entire industries more effectively than code alone. And so, as Microsoft grew, Gates hardened. Friends became rivals, rivals became enemies, and every line of software became a battlefield. His strategy was simple and brutal. Dominate, absorb, or destroy. Windows became his weapon. A graphical interface that promised simplicity for the masses, but behind the polished surface, it was a declaration of war. Competing systems were suffocated. Partnerships were traps. Developers who refused to bend were quietly erased. The world saw innovation. But inside Microsoft, the atmosphere was electric with fear. Employees whispered of Gates' temper, his relentless interrogations, his need for absolute control. He paced rooms like a general at war, drilling holes into subordinates with his gaze, demanding answers, demanding perfection. It worked. Microsoft became a kingdom. Gates its king. By the 1990s, his fortune swelled into billions. His name became synonymous with power. But the higher he climbed, the more fragile the ground beneath him became. Because every kingdom has rebels, and every king, enemies waiting in the dark. The crack in the armor, it was the mid-1990s when the decision came. The internet, a storm on the horizon, was threatening to reshape everything. Bill knew it. He felt it. Microsoft had grown fat on dominance, on Windows and Office, on a monopoly so secure it seemed untouchable. But the Internet was a new battlefield, one where control could slip from his grasp. Others were moving faster. Netscape, Sun Microsystems building visions of a future where Microsoft wasn't at the center. Gates faced a dilemma: adapt slowly, risk losing his empire, or move ruthlessly and crush the threat before it spread. He chose ruthlessness. Microsoft integrated Internet Explorer directly into Windows, giving it to every user by default, a strategy designed not to win by merit, but by suffocation. Netscape was strangled. Competitors screamed foul. And soon, the U.S. government began circling, accusing Gates of wielding monopoly power like a weapon. The trial that followed was brutal. Gates sat in depositions, his voice sharp, his face hardened into arrogance. He believed he was untouchable. He believed the system would never truly punish him. And perhaps, in a way, he was right. Microsoft survived, but not without scars. The world began to see him differently, not as a boy genius changing the world, but as a predator, hoarding power, crushing anything that stood in his way. Alone at the summit, victory came with silence. By the late 1990s, Bill Gates was the richest man alive. His empire stretched across the globe. Microsoft controlled not just software, but the very architecture of modern life. And yet, in the stillness of his mansion, he felt a creeping emptiness. Because power does not fill the void. Success does not silence the questions. He looked around at his fortune and saw walls, not windows. He thought of friends he had lost, of enemies he had created. He thought of how his name was no longer spoken with admiration, but with suspicion, even fear. The decision that had brought him everything, the choice to seize power at all costs, had also stolen something he could never reclaim: innocence. The reflection in the mirror, one night, standing before a mirror in the dim light of his bathroom, Bill Gates stared at his own reflection. The face that looked back was older, sharper, burdened. He whispered to himself, as if asking the man in the glass, was it worth it? The mirror did not answer, but in his heart, he knew the truth. He had won, and yet he had lost something greater, because every decision carries a price, and his price was written in silence, in sleepless nights, in the isolation of a man who had conquered the world, but found no peace within it. A turning point. The years would drag forward, pulling him into philanthropy, into reinvention, into the role of a benefactor instead of a conqueror. But the shadows of his past never left. He could give away billions. He could heal the sick, feed the hungry, build the future. But he could never undo the moment when ambition eclipsed everything else. That moment, the decision to dominate instead of coexist, defined him forever. And tonight, as the city lights flickered below his window, he returned to it again, reliving the choice, reliving the fear, reliving the hunger that had once driven him. The world would remember him as a genius, as a billionaire, as a philanthropist. But he would always remember himself as something else, a man haunted by a decision he could never escape. The rain tapped gently against the glass, a faint rhythm marking the hours as Bill Gates sat in the darkness. He had spent his life racing against time, faster than rivals, faster than governments, faster than the shadows of his own conscience. But time always catches up. And now, in the stillness of age, it had cornered him. He thought of the boy he once was, awkward, brilliant, restless. That boy had not dreamed of empires or monopolies. That boy had only wanted to build something elegant, something useful. But the world has a way of twisting purity into ambition. And ambition, once unleashed, devours everything. The echo of rivals' gates often revisited the ghosts of those he had crushed. Netscape, Novell, Lotus, tiny companies, innovators with sparks of genius, erased from the map because they stood in his way. Their names no longer meant anything to the masses. Forgotten, buried, but not to him. He remembered meetings where CEOs begged for survival, their voices trembling, offering partnerships, offering peace. He remembered dismissing them with a smile colder than steel. And he remembered the look in their eyes, the look of men who realized, in that moment, that their life's work was about to vanish. It was victory. But it was also damnation. Because once you've stared into the eyes of a man you've destroyed, you never truly forget. They follow you. Their silence becomes part of your silence. And in the loneliness of his later years, Gates found that silence unbearable. The government's shadow, the antitrust trial, had been a public humiliation. The world saw his arrogance, his refusal to bend, his stubborn insistence that he was right, even when every camera captured his fury. For years, he had believed himself above the law. Microsoft's dominance was absolute until it wasn't. The courts had not destroyed the company, but they had stripped away his invincibility. Suddenly, he was no longer just the world's richest man. He was a symbol of greed, of excess, of the danger of unchecked power. The irony was sharp. The same intelligence that had built his empire had blinded him. He thought strategy would always win, that logic would always triumph. But power does not operate in logic. Power operates in fear, in perception, in the weight of enemies gathering at your gate. The trial ended, Microsoft endured, but Bill Gates was never the same. He had seen how quickly the world could turn. He had tasted the fragility of a throne built on dominance. The pivot, it was then, in the shadow of that fall, that Gates turned toward philanthropy. To many, it looked like redemption. To him, it was something more complicated. Was it guilt? Perhaps. Was it strategy? Absolutely. Gates knew his legacy was fragile. He knew history could remember him as a tyrant of technology. So he sought a new narrative: savior, healer, benefactor. He poured billions into eradicating disease, into education, into the desperate corners of the world where his name could mean hope instead of fear. And yet even here he discovered that power follows you. Philanthropy became another empire, another battlefield. Governments bent to his influence. Organizations trembled at his funding. Entire nations shifted course at the sound of his voice. Once again, he found himself in control. Once again, he felt the thrill and the emptiness of deciding the fate of millions with a single stroke of his pen. Nights of reckoning still, in the quiet hours of the night, when no cameras watched and no headlines sang his praises, he wrestled with the truth. The disease he could not cure was not malaria or polio. It was the hunger within himself, the need to dominate, to command, to bend the world into a shape that fit his vision. He remembered the early days of Microsoft, long before the lawsuits and the billions. He remembered working beside Paul Allen, the friend who had co-founded the company with him, the man who had once shared his dreams. But friendship had not survived the empire. Paul grew ill, the bond frayed. Accusations lingered. Gates had pressed too hard, demanded too much, given too little. When Paul died years later, Bill felt the loss in his bones. Not just of a friend, but of a piece of himself, a reminder that some choices cannot be undone, and some debts cannot be paid. The cold weight of success. Success is a crown of thorns. From the outside, it glitters. From the inside, it cuts. Bill Gates learned this in every boardroom, every courtroom, every sleepless night. Wealth insulated him from hunger, from need, from ordinary struggle. But it could not insulate him from himself. He could travel anywhere, buy anything, command anyone but in the mirror. He faced a truth he could not purchase or silence, that he had built an empire not just on genius, but on fear, on control, on decisions that carved wounds into others. And as the years passed, he began to wonder, did the world truly need him to win as much as he did? Or had he convinced himself of that to justify the destruction he left behind. The solitude of the throne power isolates. Wealth imprisons. Gates felt it most at his mansion, where silence filled rooms large enough to swallow entire families. His children grew. His wife drifted away. The foundation consumed his days. Yet in the dark corners of the night, when the rain tapped against the windows, he felt utterly alone. Alone with his choices. Alone with his victories. Alone with his ghosts. He thought of IBM, of that first decision, the loophole that had birthed his empire. At the time, it had seemed clever, harmless, just business. But that single choice had set the pattern for everything that followed. The hunger for control, the willingness to outmaneuver, to outlast, to overpower. What began as strategy had hardened into instinct. And instinct had chained him to a destiny he could never escape. The bitter lesson now, at the edge of his life's story, Bill Gates understood what few are ever willing to admit. Every decision comes with a hidden cost. He had risen higher than kings, reshaped industries, conquered wealth itself, but the price was written across his soul. He had sacrificed peace for power, friendship for dominance, trust for control. And the cruelest part was this: the world would never see the true cost. To them, he was still the billionaire philanthropist, the face of progress, the genius who brought computers to every desk. But in the silence of his nights, he knew the truth. He had chosen power, and power had chosen loneliness in return. Final reflection. As dawn broke, spilling pale light through the blinds of his study, Bill Gates closed his eyes. The city below awakened, unaware of the storm still raging inside its most famous sun. He thought of the young man he had once been. He thought of the boy who had stared at screens filled with endless lines of code, who believed that logic could solve everything. That boy was gone. What remained was a man who had touched the heavens and discovered that the higher you climb, the colder it becomes. And in that final moment of reflection, he understood the lesson that success never teaches loudly enough, that the greatest victories are not the ones the world applauds, but the ones that leave your soul intact. Bill Gates had won everything, and in doing so, he had lost more than he could ever confess. The silence answered him now, not with comfort, but with a truth that echoed like a whisper through the years. Every decision is a debt. And sooner or later, the debt must be paid.